Russia, NATO, two sides that are just getting along swimmingly at the moment. There have been questions as of late about how such a thing could have been prevented. Could Russia perhaps have joined NATO at some point in its history, as old Putin has suggested? Realistically, I'm gonna be honest, no. Like, there's a bunch of different factors from both sides that just make even conceiving the idea as laughable. If you want to know at least my perspective on Russian-NATO relations, my last video is the best explanation you're going to get. I'm not gonna repeat it again. But that is depressing realism. Nobody likes that. Who likes that? Now is the time for us all to come together and be optimistic. Perhaps we could imagine an alternate timeline where two global superpowers were not on a collision course. One where Russia and NATO came together. How would this happen? What would exactly this alternate world look like? When would they come together? What's even happening? Who? What? Oh boy, this is probably one of the more loaded questions I have pondered. What if Russia had joined NATO? What would that even entail? When would that entail? There have been multiple times throughout history that Russia has asked to join NATO, both sincerely and insincerely. All times regardless, they have been shot down. Now every side has their reasons for not joining together, and since all of you are probably going to tell me your reason for why these two don't get along, I want you to think of that reason right now. You think of it? That doesn't happen in this alternate timeline. It could be entirely illogical, it might not make sense, but we're being optimistic. Everyone gets along for no reason, regardless of ideology. Russia and NATO find a way to come together and form the same collective alliance. That isn't NATO, because Russia never would have joined NATO itself. I lied. NATO, at least as we know it, doesn't exist in any optimistic scenario. I probably just got myself demonetized. There is no hope here, but there is always hope between the Russians and the West in a mutual alliance. That isn't NATO. One that takes both sides and gives them a voice and a head. Think of it like two heads. A two-headed eagle. Okay, bad example. Better. But before even imagining a scenario where these two actually came together, a little contemporary if you ask me, we should talk about the first time this was attempted. 1953, Stalin is dead. The new regime in the USSR wished to de-Stalinize some of the more extreme elements within the nation. Let some political enemies out of the gulag here, be less militaristic there. Khrushchev and Molotov came to the West with an offer. How about we sweep aside all that animosity during the Stalin years and come together? If this whole NATO thing you just created isn't anti-Russian or anti-communist, then it shouldn't be an issue if we joined as well, right? To which the Western nations all metaphorically laughed at the awkward moment, shuffled out of the room, and slammed the door behind them. Taking this as the response they expected, the Soviets in return formed their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, a year later. The Cold War as we know it was officially on. Yeah. Woo! So when imagining a world where the Soviets were somehow just accepted by the very alliance that was formed to oppose them, it does force us to take some liberties. We'll have to make both sides more accepting of coming together. We're being optimistic here, it's not brainwashing, optimistic. Have negotiations go in a better way. More compromises are made. Basically, the West doesn't care that the Soviets are not Western and democratic, and the Soviets don't care that the West is capitalistic. All come together in this new umbrella alliance thing. First question, if two mortal enemies come together in a defensive alliance, what exactly are they defending against?
And don't just say China.
Both clearly had different ideas about what the future of Europe should be. Both are not gonna simply let bygones be bygones. So would such an alliance even work if both sides only tried to undermine the other? No. Like, of course not. But that's the point. What if in this alternate timeline, there wasn't an iron curtain, but more like a iron patchwork?
What?
The future of Europe isn't split. It's pretty much a free-for-all. And I know it sounds incredibly stupid, and it's because it is. We all know that if the West and Soviets came together united, they would still fight. The only thing that changes in this alternate world is that instead of two military blocs hating each other, we have one loose alliance of nations that have no real goal outside of general European unity, like a multi-headed dragon that fights amongst itself. For both sides, such an alliance wouldn't really be an alliance together, more of an alliance agreeing to look the other way whenever the other side does something bad. And the only reason they are agreeing to look away is that they're doing the exact same thing as well. Think of this alternate alliance as a house divided where the family is constantly fighting, trying to upstage one another, many regretting why they ever moved in or were even born. It's not a great environment, and that is pretty much what Europe becomes. Americans and Soviets looking the other way as they each try to upstage and sabotage the other, in their own alliance, spheres within spheres. It's like how NATO just sort of ignored Turkey when they invaded Cyprus. Well, whoops, they're in our alliance, guess we can't do anything. The fun part of this is militarily, due to being allied, neither side has a red line. There is no Article 5 that is triggered if one alliance member attacks the other. So there are no barriers. It's one constant hodgepodge of double dealing, espionage, funding rebellions and revolutions, and maybe even some invasions from here or there. It's like stupid mutually assured destruction. Geopolitics as we know it, turned on its head. Do countries even act like this? Well, they do now. This is the pure chaos timeline. It's entirely possible that we could see many situations like Hungary in 1956. For both sides, this would be like a ship that is constantly leaking, dealing with undermining and protests against their ideology at any turn. The bear and eagle fighting over the wheel, and we're all going off the edge. There is also another timeline, other than that alternate timeline. Number 2, if you will. When the Soviets first asked to join NATO, they kinda did it insincerely. They proposed that the United States be relegated to a non-voting partner within the alliance, which was considered laughable by the West and seen as an attempt to just kick the US out, which it was. Yet what if the British and French for some reason just agreed? What if they decided that Europe, no matter what, should just come together regardless of ideology after the end of World War II. America loses its voting privileges, the Soviets join NATO, and it just kinda becomes an alliance for all. Of course, the US never would have stood for this. Realistically, had this happened, the entire experiment probably would have just been called off, and the US would have just went home and made another alliance. However, let's stick with this. America loses power within their own club because of Russia. They're pretty much just kicked out and we're stuck with a wacky situation where NATO still exists, just without the US. By the 1950s, we'd be seeing a United States that had been pretty much kicked out of Europe by its own allies, taking this as a, hey, thanks for helping out, champ, and also with that whole rebuilding thing, but we'll take it from here. I could imagine the Americans would feel a bit slighted and jaded that such a thing occurred. Ironically, the United States could fall back into an isolationist mindset after World War II, leaving Europe to their own devices. A Europe that has no American influence, no bases in Germany or the Mediterranean. Instead, the Americans simply remain a naval power globally, but are no longer involved in Europe. The Russian dream. And to the Soviets, this would just be a goldmine, a situation they didn't expect to work. Because who would expect it to work? It didn't work. I just made it up. But these alternate lucky Soviets have made their dreams come true with one dumb gamble. What results from the US pulling out of NATO at Europe's request is pretty simple. A lot of left-wing movements, both genuine and perhaps facilitated, happen more frequently throughout Europe. In this extremely unrealistic scenario that Europe collectively kicks the Americans out and brings in the Soviets, it's pretty clear what would happen. NATO, without the United States and with the Soviets, would ironically become the Warsaw Pact of this world. Results may vary. To sum up this whole zany scenario, the Soviets join NATO in this alternate timeline. They kick the Americans out with the help of Europe and undermine the idea of NATO. Essentially, just by asking nicely, the Soviets win the Cold War in Europe. Britain and France kinda just give up. New leftist revolutions spring up across the continent. It's goofy and stupid, but it sure is entertaining. Yet that's simply the Soviets. What about Russia? The question you probably came here for in the first place. Look, I know it took a while, but I wanted to talk about the Soviets first, okay? Sue me. This is the million-dollar question. Man, what would our world currently look like if after the fall of the USSR in the 90s, the Russian Federation joined up with NATO, just like Putin said they wanted to? Would this have worked? No. Once again, we have the same conundrum that happened with the Soviets asking in the 50s. Two superpowers that opposed one another would never want to come together in the same alliance. Even with the Cold War over and both nations now capitalistic, it doesn't change the geopolitical realities on the ground. Russia cares about Russian interests. All nations do, regardless of how those interests affect their neighbors. Same with the US. This is the sad reality of living next to a superpower. Their interests and their neighbors' interests are not often the same. Russia also doesn't view itself as simply another European state. Even after the collapse of the USSR, even with everything going wrong in the 90s, the Russian state didn't want to simply become one of those nations. Which is what joining NATO would kind of force them to do. Which brings us to the question of NATO. The reality is Russia would have never wanted to join. Joining NATO would mean subjecting themselves to the rules of others and would strip them of some autonomy as a superpower. Superpowers don't join their enemy's alliance. And if they did join NATO, it would be under the circumstances that the US's power is limited, just like it was proposed in the 50s, which also wouldn't happen. The most realistic possibility is that this alternate timeline goes down the path that Yeltsin originally hoped for. NATO, as the Cold War entity we knew it as, is disbanded. It is replaced with a collective pan-European alliance that operates on an entirely different structure than NATO. It has more equal power for both Russia and the US. In many ways, it's the US simply disarming in Europe, no longer having bases and a large-scale military presence on the continent. Think of it like Russia's best-case scenario. Again, the general atmosphere going forward past the fall of the USSR is that Russia is no longer a threat, and the US geopolitically focuses on other parts of the globe. Long story short, sorry Eastern Europe, you're on your own. Like, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Russia immediately would begin trying to influence their neighbors. The Baltics and Poland especially. Even the angry commenters down below won't even try to argue against this. They'll say that it's Russia's right as a power to control their smaller neighbors if they wish. And that's exactly what would happen. As an example, Estonia in our timeline was being accused of creating an apartheid against Russians by Yeltsin in the 90s. Regardless of whether Putin rises or not, this is going to be something that will occur. Any nation that has a prominent Russian population would someday lose that land. The US in this alliance would kind of just ignore it. Communism has been destroyed, we don't care about what Russia does from now on. Russia would promote pro-Moscow politicians and governments in the East to keep at least some remnant of the USSR alive. The European Union as we know it would be a bit smaller. Yet on paper, officially at least, Russia and the West would be on the same team. America would be focused on other parts of the world, and it would drive China crazy. There is a reason why China always sides with Russia, and it isn't simply because both have the same, worldview. Russia keeps the West busy. When these two clash with one another, it keeps the West, and most particularly the United States, from interfering with China. That is why no matter what Russia does, China will always support them. Because Russia, for China, is like a big North Korea, a buffer that keeps their real enemies at bay, even if they have to bail them out from time to time. And that's why in this alternate timeline where all of Europe comes together, it would terrify China. Instead of simply worrying about their coast, China now has to worry about the massive border with Russia to their north. While authoritarian, in our timeline, China still tries to take issues through a calm and collective manner, at least compared to Russia, and it's because by playing all sides they come out on top. Yet if 2 out of the 3 global superpowers are united, then that just makes them the sole target. And their actions following the 90s would in many ways mirror the paranoia that we saw Putin go down in our timeline. Competition with the Russians over Central Asia and particularly Mongolia. Perhaps China even tries to do something with Taiwan. And as the factory of the globe, realistically, there would be very little for the West or Russia to do anything about it. The sanctions we see against Russia today are only possible because the Russian state doesn't provide the West with anything other than cheap gas, which explains the gas prices. But China makes everything. If they were belligerent and sanctions came down, sure, it would hurt their own rising economy, but sanctions would destroy the economy of the US and Europe, who rely entirely on cheap foreign products. In this alternate timeline, we wouldn't see China invading all of their neighbors, but they would be more active against them, and the West and Russia would be powerless to do anything about it. It is a problem imagining how two rivals would come together. Both would wish to maintain their own autonomy without the other interfering. And when two superpowers are a part of the same organization, even one like the United Nations, the best result that often comes from it is inaction. Which is why in many ways this scenario seems so general. Inaction is the scenario. The best this new alternate alliance can do is nothing. And like I said earlier, do geopolitics even work like that? In an alternate timeline where NATO didn't expand, and everyone came together in this alliance originally proposed to include all of Europe, it would still be divided into spheres. Even outside of the idea of NATO, Russia prides itself on being fundamentally different from Western Europe. That's just the reality without fundamentally changing the societies and governments of both. Whether or not this is a positive outcome really depends on where you're located and where your allegiances lie. Your average Russian is probably not having the best time right now. Everything from the outside world has been shut down or censored. The only news you can get is from the state. And YouTube itself might not even be available anymore. The government and state have a lot of control over what we can see on the internet. And while your average Russian, let's be honest, has probably been using a VPN for years now, you might not. And that's why this video is sponsored by NordVPN. They're more important than ever when your IP address can limit what information you receive. The internet in its entirety should be available for everyone. NordVPN allows you to not only hide your IP address, but allows you to browse on servers from across the globe. It also helps protect your information. NordVPN has actually just introduced threat protection. What's that? Threat protection is a new defense that steps up your cybersecurity. It protects your downloads, stops any malicious sites, intrusive ads, and even trackers. It's a new system that can even work when you're not using a VPN at all. Take control of your internet experience today with NordVPN. Right now you can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount plus 1 additional month for free when you go to nordvpn.com/althist. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/althist or click the link in the description below. If you think now is a better time than ever to start being free of state-dependent censorship, then I'd say NordVPN is right for you. Japanese Netflix.